Win big with new DRF All Access past performances. With one best-in-class product, you now get all three past performance formats. Go to DRF.com and use coupon code 1FREEPP for a free single card today.
Hi everyone, Brad Free with David Aragona. This is Daily Racing Forum's Derby Watch, and a week ago, I think most everyone conceded Kentucky Derby favoritism to fierceness. He still may be the favorite, but David, after what happened last weekend at Keeneland, maybe there are two favorites this year in the Kentucky Derby?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that all unfolds and where the bettors for the Derby ultimately place their wagers, because it does seem like Fierceness has a big following based on the huge speed figure that he ran the Florida Derby. But I think the reliability factor lies with Sierra Leone, and a lot of handicappers who watched last week's Bluegrass just feel like that late run that he puts in is relentless and is going to be well suited to that long stretch of Churchill Downs. So we'll see how that all plays out. But as we take a look at our top 20 for this week's Derby Watch, he is still in the same position, second to Fierceness, but I did lower the odds considerably from 6-1 down to 7-2 on Sierra Leone, as I imagine that these two are going to be closely grouped towards the top of the wagering with a big gap to everybody else come Derby Day.
Yeah, these two, talking about Fierceness and Sierra Leone, they seem to have kind of broken away from the pack. I thumbed through some back Kentucky Derby charts trying to find the last time there were two horses this closely matched in the low odds range. I had to go all the way back to 1997 to find a similar situation. That was when Captain Bodgett and Silver Charm were 3-1 and 4-1 respectively, and they finished 1-2 in the Kentucky Derby. It's not often you have two, I'm going to refer to them as co-favorites. Clearly Fierceness is the favorite, at least as of now, but it's not often you have two Kentucky Derby starters who have such huge followings and are both likely to start in the low odds range. So we're going to talk more about Sierra Leone's, it's not really a breakout win, but it was an impressive win in the Bluegrass. His odds were trimmed almost in half from 6-1 down to 7-2. And David, the other, there were a couple other big changes to Derby Watch. First of all, Deterministic is off the list. We'll talk about him in just a minute, but Just a Touch, who was 25-1, and you cut him down to 12-1. He ran well in the Bluegrass, and that's the reason for the odds change, correct?
Yeah, I think you could make the argument, we'll talk more about this when we get to the Bluegrass, but you could make the argument that he ran just as well as the winner in the Bluegrass based on the way the pace played out. He was a very game second, well clear of a good field in behind him, earned a nice 96 speed figure, buyer speed figure. So he feels like a horse that is attracting some support coming into the Kentucky Derby, but he's a very lightly raced runner, which is 3 starts under his belt. So he's got that working against him, but he is one that I expect to attract some support on Derby Day.
No doubt about it. Resilience was the Wood winner. He's on the list. Grand Mo the first. As of this morning, he's ranked 21st on the points list. He's not quite in the field yet. That certainly could change. And then Society Man, runner-up in the Wood Memorial, also added to the list. He's in the Derby field with 50 points. David, let's talk about the 3 drops from last week's list. And they were all the result of what transpired in the Wood Memorial. Deterministic was the odds-on favorite, expected to win the Wood and go into Churchill Downs as one of the favorites. He completely misfired. As of today, he's not out of the Kentucky Derby yet, but we took him off of Derby Watch. Chris Clement, who's never started a horse in the Kentucky Derby, I don't think he wants to go to Churchill Downs with a horse who lost by more than 17 lengths. Uncle Heavy finished 5th and Tuscan Sky finished 7th. So kind of easy defections from Derby Watch list. But the ads were, I don't know, a couple of them were a little bit unexpected. Resilience and Society Man 1-2 in the Wood, and then Grand Mo the first as well.
Yeah, Resilience, obviously the Wood winner. He's got the points to get into the race. He does feel like a horse that's moving forward at the right time. He's obviously going to have to take another step forward to be effective in a race like the Kentucky Derby, but he answered all the questions that have been asked of him so far by winning the Wood. Society Man, big surprise, 106-1 runner-up in the Wood Memorial. He's got the points. Sounds like he'll be in the race. And Gradmo the first, as you said, currently 21st on the points list, but I think we're expecting Deterministic to eventually be declared out of the Kentucky Derby. We're still waiting on word for that. As you said, it sounds based on some of the post-race quotes from Christophe Clement like he would be unlikely to go, but we're going to still wait for some of that official confirmation.
Yeah, and the other horse that's a little bit uncertain right as of now is Endlessly, who is in the Kentucky Derby field if he wants to be. I still think that he might be leaning toward the Grade 2 American Turf on the Derby undercard, but he's not out of the field yet, talking about endlessly. So we'll stay tuned with regards to that. One other minor odds revision that you made since last week, David, and I thought you were pretty kind, actually. Dornoch was 15-1, and you moved him up slightly to 20-1. So why don't we go ahead and start talking about where the race where I think Dornoch was exposed and where Sierra Leone was confirmed as the real deal.
Yeah, Sierra Leone definitely delivered in this bluegrass. Yes, he got a strong pace ahead of him, but you have to really just respect the run that this horse seems to put in every single time. We saw it in the Risen Star where he was able to close into a slow pace. Not the case in this bluegrass, had horses contesting the pace up front, but he still made that eye-catching run around the far turn. And I really liked the way Tyler Gaffalione handled this horse, having the confidence to send him inside past the half-mile pole, then angling outside halfway around the far turn, and he just mowed this field down through the stretch. So a really impressive performance. Nice to see that incremental Beyer speed figure improvement up to a 98, and he feels like a legitimate Kentucky Derby contender.
Let's go ahead and take a look at the stretch run of the bluegrass. This was last Saturday at Keeneland, and Sierra Leone, who was reluctant to load, he was actually positioned last going into the far turn. But David, as you mentioned, Gaffalione kind of steered him in through some traffic, circled wide into the stretch. Just a Touch takes the lead at the 8th pole, and under normal circumstances, he would win this race, but I don't think Sierra Leone is a normal horse. What do you think?
No, and he's one that I don't think you have to really worry about the stretch out in distance to 1.25 miles. I think that's the big outstanding question for a lot of these 3-year-olds. He gives the vibe that he's supposed to be right at home going 10 furlongs, and especially if the Derby unfolds with the pace that it typically does, you typically do see 45, 46 half-mile fractions in the Kentucky Derby. That's going to suit Sierra Leone just fine. He's just the kind of horse that is going to have to work out a trip through traffic in that 20-horse field. That's never a given for a horse that comes from as far back as he does. But if the trip works out, you've got to imagine he's the kind of horse that is going to show up on the first Saturday in May.
Yeah, that to me is the biggest challenge facing Sierra Leone, is working out a trip, because he's going to have to negotiate a lot of traffic to come from near the back of the field, to the wire in front in the Kentucky Derby. But the way that he ran in the bluegrass suggests to me that he can do it. And David, you mentioned earlier about his incremental Beyer speed figure improvement, 71 to 91 to 95 to 98. He hasn't taken a step backward. He finishes at shorter distances like a horse that will absolutely love 1.25 miles. And I think that Sierra Leone stamped himself as definitely the close second choice behind Fierceness. Now, what about the runner-up? Because Just a Touch, he also made a forward move. It just turned out to be second best. What about Just a Touch in the bluegrass?
I really liked his performance, and he's another one that's been improving with each start. Obviously, there've only been 3 of those so far, but he was visually impressive on debut, was a good second in the Gotham. Obviously, we didn't see the good version of Deterministic come back and flatter that form in the Wood, but I think something else went on with Deterministic that day. And Just the Touch, he moved forward off his Gotham performance in this bluegrass. As I said, the pace of the race was very fast, and he was the one that was closest to it. Top Connor, who set the pace, he ended up fading to lose this race by 8 lengths. Not so for Just the Touch. He took the lead in mid-stretch, and I thought was pretty game to finish nearly 4 lengths clear of the rest of this field, just 1.5 lengths behind the winner. He's a really good horse, and based on the stamina that he showed to be second after chasing that fast pace in the bluegrass, maybe 1.25 miles is within his scope. It's just a question of inexperience with him.
Yeah, the inexperience issue, that would be a concern for me several years ago. I don't know that it's that much of a factor anymore, because Mage last year won the Kentucky Derby in the 4th start of his career. Justify in 2018 won the Kentucky Derby in the 4th start of his career. And not to compare Just a Touch to Mage or Justify, only to illustrate that a horse can in fact win the Derby with only 3 starts under his belt. And you can even go back to Big Brown back in 2008, who won the Derby in the 4th start of his career. So his inexperience to me is not an issue. I guess to me, the issue is, how is he going to hold off Sierra Leone at 1.25 miles? I do know this: Just a Touch will get first run over Sierra Leone, and maybe Sierra Leone gets bogged down in traffic. But he's an improving horse. Just a Touch is. He was 25-1. He's 12-1, 5th choice on Derby Watch this week. So a couple of good ones. David, I think that Dornoch was kind of exposed as, he's a good horse, not going to knock him. I just don't like him going into the Kentucky Derby off what he showed in the Bluegrass. His progress seems to have stalled. What's your take on Dornoch?
Yeah, he's one of many horses that still has a lot to prove heading into the Kentucky Derby. As you saw in our top 20 list, I have him listed at 20-1 right now. I have a big clump of horses listed between 20 and 25-1. I could have had him really anywhere within those that group of runners, because he just has some questions to answer about whether he's really taken that step forward from his 2-year-old to 3-year-old season. We didn't really see the progression in the Fountain of Youth, where he was somewhat unimpressive, a workman-like victory against inferior competition. And then last time out in the Bluegrass, as you said, just kind of exposed as maybe not able to take that step forward from the Fountain of Youth. I know the narrative around him was that he was only 75-80% cranked for the Fountain of Youth. Well, he was fitter for the Bluegrass and just didn't run that much better. It sounds like the connections want him to be more forwardly placed in the Kentucky Derby and want to give that more aggressive ride that can get him to the front end. Brad, I just don't know if this horse is fast enough to make the lead over some other very fast horses like Fierceness that are pointing to the Derby.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you said, David. I think the one thing that we can take away from the Bluegrass is that they're not going to take Dornoch back in the Kentucky Derby. I suspect that they are going to send him, and he will help ensure a legitimate pace. As you said earlier, usually the Derby unfolds at a legitimate clip, and I think that Dornoch, I believe that he's going to be aggressively ridden in the Kentucky Derby, and he will be one of a handful of horses that are going to be contesting the early lead. But as far as him winning the Derby, that to me would be a shock. As for Sierra Leone and Just a Touch, not at all. 7-2 second choice for Sierra Leone. Just a Touch now the 12-1 fifth choice on David's morning line. Let's turn our attention to Aqueduct, where the Wood Memorial last Saturday, David, was expected to deliver a top Kentucky Derby contender. Maybe it did, but it certainly was not the one that we expected.
Yeah, it's just hard to know what to make of this race because we had 3 Derby Watch horses competing in the Wood Memorial. They have all since dropped off the list, and unsurprisingly, when that happens, it was a parade of long shots behind the winner, Resilience, who was, I believe, the 3rd choice in the wagering. He made some sense coming in here. He had run well in the Risen Star, which is proving to be one of the key prep races for the Kentucky Derby. The top 5 finishers in the Risen Star have now all qualified for the Derby, and they are expected to be in the starting gate on the first Saturday in May. Resilience, the 4th place finisher that day, bettered that result to win the Wood Memorial, and I thought it did it quite decisively. It's just a question of what was really behind him and how much faster can he run, because his top buyer of 90 not quite going to get it done against this group.
Yeah, that's my concern as well with regards to Resilience in the Wood and also in Stronghold in the Santa Anita Derby, which we'll talk about in just a minute. David, you mentioned the Risen Star. Sierra Leone won the Risen Star. He came back and won the Bluegrass. Catching Freedom was 3rd in the Risen Star, won the Louisiana Derby, and Resilience 4th in the Risen Star, and he came back and win the Wood. And then you have 5th place finisher Honor Marie came back and finished 2nd, did a graded stake as well. So that was a very powerful race that Resilience came out of, and he delivered in the Wood. He earned the exact same number in the Wood that he did in the Risen Star. So maybe he won the race because everybody ran down to his level. Is that possible?
And we should say that buyer for the Risen Star, there's an article on DRF.com. Andrew Beyer did upgrade it 5 points from what it was, justifiably so. I think that was one of those days, Risen Star Day, where there was some question about whether that wet track had gotten a little slower later in the day. And I think you can reasonably make that case in retrospect, given what you just cited, the positive runbacks from that race. And yeah, Resilience, I thought he got a very good trip to win the Wood Memorial. And he is the kind of horse that can make his own good trips. He's got that good tactical speed, doesn't need to be on the lead, so he should get a good trip in the Derby somewhere in that second flight of runners. Bill Mott put the blinkers on, and I think the horse responded just fine to them in the Wood Memorial, but he's just going to have to get a little bit faster, and we don't yet know if he can run the kind of speed figure that's going to be required to be a Derby winner.
Let's take a look at the stretch run of the Wood. I don't think we've done that yet, and Resilience got a great trip under Johnny Velasquez. He was a little hard to handle early, Resilience was, but he settled down and got to the outside, and he ended up getting a fairly advantageous trip. He drifted out a little bit through the lane. I don't know if he kind of lost interest, thought the race was over or whatever, but this was a fairly convincing victory by Resilience. Society Man improved off of his maiden win, improved 5 points, and would finish second at 106-1. With regards to resilience, I guess the biggest change going into the Kentucky Derby is who is he going to be ridden by? Because John Velasquez is already booked to ride Fierceness. I don't think he's going to take off the early Derby favorite to ride Resilience. So Bill Mott has a decision to make with regards to Resilience. I think we probably all know who the leading candidates are, guys who Mott typically uses, but he will have a new jockey for Resilience when he makes his next start in the Kentucky Derby. And he's kind of I think he's an improving horse, even though all he did was match his last start buyer, but he did it the right way in the Wood Memorial.
And Resilience does strike me as a horse that is not going to have problems with distance, even though he's by Into Mischief. He is this big, rangy son of that sire, and Into Mischief can certainly get horses, not just to win the Derby, but to go marathon distances. And he definitely gives the vibe watching him run that stamina is not a concern for him.
We should probably at least touch on Society Man. He's in the Derby with 50 points. I can't find him to finish second even after the race. And I think he's going to be a big price in the Kentucky Derby. Do we need to take him seriously at all, talking about Society Man?
I thought I was crazy when I picked him to win the Withers way back when in February. He disappointed me that day at 22-1. Apparently, I missed the boat at 106-1 when he was second in the Wood Memorial. Took him a little while to come around. I liked the first couple starts of his career a bit, but I mean, obviously, he's come a long way since then. Still has to come a long way to be considered a serious Kentucky Derby threat.
Yeah, he does. And actually, so does Resilience. And the same thing probably applies to the winner of the Santa Anita Derby. There was only one horse listed on Derby Watch who ran in the Santa Anita Derby, and thankfully, he kind of delivered. It wasn't a very fast race, David, but Stronghold got the money in the Santa Anita Derby.
And I think what you have to admire about Stronghold is just his reliability. He shows up every time. He's answered every question so far. He's always involved in the finish. 6 starts. He's been in the Exacta all 6 times with 3 victories. And he's taken sort of an unconventional path to get to the Kentucky Derby. He's sort of flown under the radar the entire time. We've talked about how we didn't really expect a California-based runner to even qualify for the Kentucky Derby this year. And he sort of did it his own way, going to Sunland Park, getting the necessary points there, and then tackling the Santa Anita Derby, which has come up a race, Brad, that was a little softer than I think we were expecting maybe a month or 2 ago, when it seemed like Bob Baffert had so much firepower and ammunition for that race. A couple of his top prospects weren't even entered in the race, and it just turned out to be a winnable race for Stronghold.
Yeah, it turned out to be a winnable race, even though he did not improve figure-wise from his win in the Sunland Derby. But I like the way that Stronghold did it. And he's been ridden his last 3 starts, actually his last 4 starts, by Antonio Frisu. And I talked to Frisu after the Santa Anita Derby. I said, what was your game plan going in? And he said it was simple. I was just going to follow Frankie Dettori. Now, Frankie Dettori earlier on Saturday at Santa Anita had won 6 consecutive races, and he was riding the favorite Imagination. So I think Frisu came up with a pretty good blueprint for the race, following Dettori, who was riding Imagination, Frisu on Stronghold. And let's roll the tape of the stretch run of the Santa Anita Derby. And 3 from the inside, Stronghold kind of had to bull his way between Imagination and EJ Won the Cup. He was already under a drive at the quarter pole. This horse is just a grinder. I don't think he's brilliant, but he wants to beat you. 6 starts, 3 wins, 3 seconds, and he beat a pretty good horse in Imagination.
Yeah, he's definitely not the flashiest type, but he's gritty. You could see it there, just finding that room between horses when it didn't look like there was really space for a full horse at the top of the stretch. He got in there and was able to gut out the victory over Imagination. And, he did what was required in the Sunland Park Derby. We saw that grit even in defeat in the Los Alamitos Futurity towards the end of last year. He's just run well and has been steadily improving at almost every start. I personally haven't always viewed him as a horse that was going to keep getting better with added distance, but I'll say he's proven me wrong up until this point, improving his speed figures, going the mile and an eighth. So, I mean, he definitely belongs in this race. Whether or not he's a legitimate contender and how strong some of these West Coast preps really were, I still have questions about it, Brad.
And so do I. I don't think that he's good enough to win the Kentucky Derby, but for, vertical exotics, I'm not going to leave him out of the 3-hole in the trifecta for sure, because Stronghold, he will run his race. Where that puts him at the finish line definitely remains to be seen. look, the Santa Anita Derby came back with an 89 buyer speed figure. It's one of the lowest rated Santa Anita Derbies in history. And I went back and looked to find another Santa Anita Derby winner who won the race with a figure comparable to Stronghold. And I found one in 2017. Gormley won the Santa Anita Derby with an 88 buyer speed figure. In his next start, he was 22-1 in the Kentucky Derby, and he finished nowhere. It's one example of what the challenge facing Stronghold, who ran the same number virtually as Gormley, and Gormley, you couldn't find him in the Derby. And I just wonder if that's going to be the same case this year with the Santa Anita Derby winner in the Kentucky Derby. I guess we'll find out in 3.5 weeks. Time for some quick takeaways. I'm not making any Kentucky Derby selections today. We still have 3 weeks of Churchill Downs workouts, the post position draw. We have to analyze the pace scenario. But if I had to make a pick today, I don't really see any knock on Fierceness and or Sierra Leone. To me, they've kind of burst clear of the pack. And the only knock I can find is that they're going to be relatively short prices. There are plenty of long shots out there in the Kentucky Derby to tinker with. And you know that a couple of them that I like are Mystic Dan and Just Steel. But to me, the two favorites, Fierceness and Sierra Leone, both are deserving favorites and or co-favorites. Okay, Stronghold, right in my backyard here in Southern California. I'm glad he delivered. His connections are easy folks to root for. Trained by Phil D'Amato, ridden by Antonio Frisu, and two of the nicest owners that you could ever meet, Rick and Sharon Waller. They bred Stronghold's Dam Spectator. They raced her. And regardless of what happens in the Kentucky Derby in 3.5 weeks, one of my favorite memories of spring will be what happened in the Santa Anita press box on Saturday afternoon. The Wallers, Rick and Sharon Waller, watched the Santa Anita Derby from the press box. And you don't normally see Santa Anita Derby owners watching their race from the press box. And we're going to roll a quick clip, a video clip that it was taken on an iPhone. And you'll see what I mean when you hear about unbridled enthusiasm. So let's roll that tape.
Come on, baby! Come on, baby! Come on, baby!
I love it. That's Rick Waller and his wife Sharon behind him, and they were absolutely thrilled. A horse that they bred just beat a $1 million yearling Imagination, and the Wallers are headed toward the Kentucky Derby. And you just have to love the enthusiasm. That's why we love the game, whether you're an owner, a trainer, a jockey, a breeder, a horse player. It's when your horse crosses the wire first, raise your hands up in the air and say yes. And that's what Rick and Sharon Waller did on Saturday afternoon. So a couple of really nice people. I think they're up against it at Churchill Downs, but they're going to go back there and have a good time with a very good horse. David, how about some takeaways from you?
Yeah, you'll love to see that. The elation of victory. And with the Kentucky Derby, you get to know a lot of owners and connections and trainers and jockeys that maybe you weren't that familiar with ahead of time. The Derby always produces a ton of stories, and it makes those victories extra special when they do happen. As for approaching the race from a wagering standpoint, I agree. The two favorites, they look like they're pretty solid in terms of having an ability edge over this field. But I would also say they both have some major questions to answer. We already talked about Sierra Leone having to navigate that trip through traffic, a deep closer in the Derby, not the easiest thing to do. And horses that have been short prices that are deep close in the Derby, they don't have this most stellar record. And then we've got Fierceness, who on his day, I mean, he is brilliant. Nobody would doubt that he is the most talented horse in this field from a raw ability standpoint, but he's been a little bit of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and we don't know what we're going to get from him in terms of whether the trip, the break, the other pace in this race, that could all be real problems for Fierceness. So if you're looking to take a shot against these horses, I think there are reasons to do so. The question, where do you go? Well, we've got some weeks to sort it out, but not the easiest question to answer. I will say, doing some preliminary handicapping, there are some horses in that 20 to 25 to 1 bracket that I think you can start to make cases for, but I'm going to try to spend some time doing that over the next few weeks.
That sounds cool. Well, we're going to skip the On the Bubble segment this week, because this week's On the Bubble, it's virtually the Lexington Stakes on Saturday at Keeneland, and several of the horses that are entered in the Lexington still have Kentucky Derby aspirations. So let's take a real quick look at the field for the Lexington. And this is the final points race. You only get 20 points to the winner, 10 points to the runner-up. But there are a couple of horses in this field, David, who've been on Derby Watch, including Hades and Liberal Arts. If Hades pops up and wins the Lexington, I believe that he is guaranteed a berth in the Kentucky Derby. If he finishes second, I think some things have to happen. And the same thing with Encino and Liberal Arts. If they win the Lexington, they can still make the Derby if some other things happen. So there's some sorting out to do. And we're going to find out as far as the Lexington goes, what the final pieces are of the Derby puzzle. Are you handicapping this race on video?
Yeah, I'm doing a video preview of this tomorrow with my colleague Craig Mulkowski. So we'll put out some handicapping opinions about this Lexington. It does seem like a fun race to sift through.
For sure. The Wine Steward is the 5-2 favorite on the morning line. He's not going to run in the Kentucky Derby. He's making his first start of the year, I do believe. On the Bubble will return next week after the final prep. David and I will talk about the Lexington and the prospective Kentucky Derby field next week on Derby Watch. So until then, for David, I'm Brad. Thanks for watching.